Part 7. Special Economic Issues. Chapter 24. Myths about Markets. Many a man has cherished for years as his hobby some vague shadow of an idea too meaningless to be positively false. Charles Sanders Peirce. Perhaps the biggest myth about markets comes from the name itself. We tend to think of a market as a thing, when in fact it is people engaging in economic transactions among themselves on whatever terms their competition and mutual accommodations lead to. A market, in this sense, can be contrasted with central planning or government regulation. Too often, however, when a market is conceived of as a thing, it is regarded as an impersonal mechanism, when in fact it is as personal as the people in it. This misconception allows third parties to seek to take away the freedom of individuals to transact with one another on mutually agreeable terms, and to depict this restriction of their freedom as rescuing people from the dictates of the impersonal market, when in fact this would be subjecting them to the dictates of third parties. There are so many myths about markets that only a sample can be presented here. For example, it is common to hear that the same thing is being sold at very different prices by different sellers, apparently contradicting the economics of supply and demand. Usually, such statements involve defining things as being the same when in fact they are not. Other common misconceptions involve the role of brand names and of non-profit organizations. While these are only a small sample of myths about prices and markets, looking at these myths closely may illustrate how easy it is to create a plausible-sounding notion and get it accepted by many otherwise intelligent people who simply do not bother to scrutinize the logic or the evidence or even to define the words they use. One of the reasons for the survival of economic myths is that many professional economists consider such beliefs to be too superficial or even downright silly to bother to refute them. But superficial and even silly beliefs have sometimes been so widespread as to become the basis for laws and policies with serious and even catastrophic consequences. Leaving myths unchallenged is risky, so scrutinizing silly notions can be a very serious matter. Prices. There seem to be almost as many myths about prices as there are prices. Most involve ignoring the role of supply and demand, but some involve confusing prices with costs. The role of prices. The very reasons for the existence of prices and the role they play in the economy have often been misunderstood. One of the oldest and most consequential of these myths is a notion summarized this way. Prices have been compared to tolls levied for private profit, or to barriers which, again, for private profit, keep the potential stream of commodities from the masses who need them. Crude as this notion might seem after examining the many economic activities coordinated by prices, it is an idea which has inspired political movements around the world, movements that have in some cases changed the history of whole nations. These movements, socialist, communist, and others, have been determined to end what they have seen as the gratuitous payment of profits that needlessly add to the prices of goods and correspondingly restrict the standard of living of the people. Implicit in this vision is the assumption that what entrepreneurs and investors receive as income from the production process exceeds the value of any contribution they may have made to that process. The plausibility of this belief and the conviction that it was true inspired people from many walks of life to dedicate their lives, sometimes risking or even sacrificing their lives, to the cause of ending exploitation. But their own political success in replacing price-coordinated economies with economies coordinated by collective political decisions took the issue beyond the realm of beliefs and into the realm of empirical evidence. During the course of the 20th century, that evidence increasingly made it painfully clear that eliminating price coordination and profits did not raise living standards, but tended to make them lower than in countries where prices remained the prevailing method of allocating resources. For decades, and even generations, many nations clung to their original assumption and the policies based on it, despite economic setbacks that were often attributed to short-run growing pains of a new economic system, or to isolated individual mistakes, rather than to problems inherent in the collective decision-making by third parties. However, by the end of the 20th century, even socialist and communist countries began abandoning government-owned economic enterprises, and all but a few die-hard countries had begun allowing prices to function more freely in their economies. A very elementary lesson about prices had been learned at a very high cost to hundreds of millions of human beings. No one would say that wages were just arbitrary charges added to the prices of goods for the financial benefit of workers, since it is obvious that there would be no production without those workers, and that they would not contribute to production unless they were compensated. Yet it took a very long time for the same thing to be realized about those who manage economic enterprises, or those whose investments pay for the structures and equipment used in such enterprises. Whether the payments received by those who contributed in these ways were unnecessarily large is a question answered by whether those same contributions are available from others at a lower cost. That question is one which those who are doing the paying have every incentive to have answered by hard facts before they pay out their own hard cash. Different prices for the same thing. Physically identical things are often sold for different prices, usually because of accompanying conditions that are quite different. Goods sold in attractively decorated stores with pleasant, polished, and sophisticated sales staffs, as well as easy return policies, are likely to cost more than physically identical products sold in a stark warehouse store with a no-refund policy. Christmas cards can usually be bought for much lower prices on December 26th than on December 24th, even though the cards are physically identical to what they were when they were in great demand before Christmas. A consumer magazine in Northern California compared the total cost of buying the identical set of food items of the same brands in various grocery stores in their area. These total costs ranged from $80 in the least expensive store to $125 in the most expensive. Indeed, they ranged from $98 to $103 at 3 different Safeway supermarkets. Part of the reason for the variations in price was the variation in the cost of real estate in different communities, the store with the lowest prices being located in less expensive Fremont, and the one with the highest prices being located in San Francisco, whose real estate prices have been among the highest of any major city in the country. The cost of the land on which the stores sat was different, and these costs had to be recovered from the prices charged the store's customers. Another reason for price differences is the cost of inventory. The cheapest store had only 49% of the items on the shopping list in stock at a given time, while all 3 Safeway stores had more than 3/4 of the items in stock. Price differences reflected differences in the costs of maintaining a larger inventory, even when the particular commodities were physically the same. Customers' costs, measured in the time spent shopping, also varied. It varied both in the time that a customer would have to spend going from store to find all the items on a shopping list, and in the time spent in checkout lines. One upscale supermarket was rated superior in the speed of its checkout line by 90% of its customers, but one of the low-price warehouse stores received a similar rating from only 12% of its customers. Consumers pay in both money and time, and those who value their time more highly are often willing to pay more money in order to save that time and the exasperation of waiting in long lines or having to go from store to buy all the items on their shopping lists. In short, people shopping at different supermarkets were paying different prices for different things, although superficially these might be called the same things based solely on their physical characteristics. Reasonable or affordable prices. A long-standing staple of political rhetoric has been the attempt to keep the prices of housing, medical care, or other goods and services reasonable or affordable. But to say that prices should be reasonable or affordable is to say that economic realities have to adjust to our budget, or to what we are willing to pay, because we are not going to adjust to the realities. Yet the amount of resources required to manufacture and transport the things we want are wholly independent of what we are willing or able to pay. It is completely unreasonable to expect reasonable prices. Price controls can, of course, be imposed by government, but we have already seen in Chapter 3 what the consequences are. Subsidies can also be used to keep prices down, but that does not change the cost of producing goods and services in the slightest. It just means that part of those costs are paid in taxes. Often related to the notion of reasonable or affordable prices is the idea of keeping costs down by various government policies. But prices are not costs. Prices are what pay for costs. Where the costs are not covered by the prices that are legally allowed to be charged, the supply of the goods or services simply tend to decline in quantity or quality, whether these goods are apartments, medicines, or other things. The cost of medical care is not reduced in the slightest when the government imposes lower rates of pay for doctors or hospitals. There are still just as many resources required as before to build and equip a hospital or to train a medical student to become a doctor. Countries which impose lower prices on medical treatment have ended up with longer waiting lists to see doctors and less modern equipment in their hospitals. Refusing to pay all the costs is not the same as lowering the costs. It usually leads to a reduction of either the quantity or the quality of the goods and services provided, or both.